Welcome to the Republic of the Rio Grande. Episode 16, The Republic of the Sierra Madre. I'm Brandon Seale. As he would many times during his long career, in 1841, Santa Anna returned to the Mexican presidency. And one of the first things he did was order an invasion of Texas. In March of 1842, a Mexican army crossed the Rio Grande and captured San Antonio. This provoked a panic in the Republic of Texas, leading to the so-called Archives War in Austin, as then-President Sam Houston ordered the capital and all of its agencies relocated to Houston. But the Mexican army actually retreated after only 2 days in San Antonio, suggesting that their mission was more mischief-making or simply probing Texian defenses than a true attempt at reconquest. No one was killed, no real shots were fired, and the event receded in Texians' minds. Until July. All through the early years of Texas independence, Texian politicians continued to claim the lands lying between the Nueces and Rio Grande. Partly in response to the San Antonio raid from March, but also in keeping with a nearly annual ritual that we've actually seen in many previous episodes of this season. In the early summer of 1842, a few hundred Texian militia began to take up a defensive position on the southern bank of the Nueces River, at a spot known as Lipantitlan. Actually, it was just a few miles away from Casablanca, the place where Rio Grande Federalists had established their short-lived government just 2 years prior in January of 1840. And now, in July of 1842, the Rio Granders returned, this time to assert their claims to the Nueces. 600 Rio Grande vaqueros surprised the disorganized Texian force gathered there and resoundingly defeated them. The historical marker on the spot today makes it sound like a Texian victory, but this seems to have been a bit of a later attempt to rewrite the lopsidedness of a defeat that sent the Texian militia fleeing north and once again put the Republic of Texas into a state of panic. Both houses of the Texas Congress passed a war bill, in fact. President Sam Houston vetoed it, but mainly for financial reasons. The young republic couldn't afford to go to war. Of course, he may also have vetoed it because he knew that a punitive expedition against the Mexican force now holding Lipantitlan wouldn't be some kind of walk in the park. That force was led by none other than Antonio Canales, the old brush fox. For all that they might curse Antonio Canales, Texians knew not to take him lightly. And it should have come as no surprise that Canales had led this force. You might recall how violently Canales had responded to any Texian claims or overtures toward possessing the lands south of the Nueces, and how he'd threatened before to attack any Texians that tried to claim those lands. This was a highly personal issue for Canales, who had written before that the territorial integrity of Mexico, but in particular Tamaulipas' historical claims to the lands all the way to the Nueces, was the only issue for which he would, quote, cease to be a Federalist, end quote. And finally, it seems, in 1842, Canales was enjoying the opportunity to make good on his threats to the Texians. Then, in October, another Mexican army captured San Antonio again, and this time held it for a week. A hurriedly mustered force of Texians eventually defeated this Mexican force at the Battle of Salado, but the entire series of events was psychologically traumatic for the fragile young republic, and Texians lashed out. An army of volunteers marched south and captured Laredo, which was still governed as a part of Mexico. Some of those volunteers then continued further south, on to the lower Rio Grande villas. They entered the old town of Mier, but that's also where their adventure ended, when they were surrounded there by Mexican forces and forced to surrender. Texas history buffs will recall what happened next to the survivors of the so-called Mier expedition. This is the famous Black Bean episode. But what even Texas history buffs may not recall was that the commander of the opposing Mexican forces in the Battle of Mier was none other than the brush fox once again, Antonio Canales, who had now chalked up his second victory against the Texians in just 6 months. Canales, to be fair, had never really trusted the Texians, even when they were serving under him as volunteers. He was willing to use them as soldiers to advance the claims of his region, But frankly, he was just as willing to use the Centralists to the same ends whenever it seemed like Texas was the greater threat. And as proof of his dim view of these Texian adventurers, we need only witness what Canales did to one of the Texian commanders of the Mir expedition, one Captain Ewan Cameron. Captain Cameron had actually been one of the leaders of the Anglo-Texian volunteers serving under Canales during the War for the Republic of the Rio Grande. Cameron, it seems, had not left a favorable impression on Canales, however. Though Canales wasn't the man who ordered the black bean treatment, whereby captured Texians were forced to draw white and black beans to decide which ones would live or die, respectively, Canales did make it a point of privilege to order Cameron's execution anyway, even though Cameron had actually drawn a white bean. Later Texans memorialized Cameron's misfortune by naming Cameron County after him, though even amongst Anglo-Texans at the time, this wasn't without controversy. Following the Mir expedition, things quieted down along the Rio Grande, for all of about 3 years. Because, of course, in January of 1846, a United States Army under General Zachary Taylor landed at Corpus Christi, south of Antonio Canales' sacred Nueces River. This occurred, however, just days after a centralist administration in Mexico City usurped the presidency from another Federalist incumbent, which triggered all kinds of bad memories for Rio Grande Federalists. As in 1838, it was unclear now to men like Antonio Canales who posed the greater threat to the Rio Grande Villas, an increasingly powerful northern neighbor, or an illegitimate homegrown administration that seemed little disposed to expend any resources on defending the people here on the northeastern border. Canales, once again, called up his fiery Federalist ally, José María Carvajal, who was godfather to two of Canales' sons and whose own son had actually married Canales' daughter. And the two got together and concocted a plan. Canales sent Carvajal to meet with General Zachary Taylor and to present him a proposal in Carvajal's perfect English. If General Taylor would support the Rio Grande Federalists in a revolt against the usurping centralist administration in Mexico City, quote, "These northern states will separate forever from Mexico," end quote. The Republic of the Rio Grande wasn't dead, it seems. It had just gone dormant. And indeed, a newspaper in soon-to-be-occupied Matamoros started calling itself the Republic of the Rio Grande, in the hopes that this movement might be resurrected. Canales and Carvajal even went so far as to draw up yet another Declaration of Independence, with plans to publish it on March 1st, 1846. But the truth is, Canales and Carvajal were playing last year's game. The Republic of Texas government had wanted a buffer sister state sitting between Texas and central Mexico. The United States government, of which Texas was now a part in 1846, could care less. General Taylor disregarded Canales' proposal, if he gave it any thought at all. By May, General Taylor had marched his army all the way south to the Rio Grande, where he was met by a Mexican army under the command of none other than old Centralist General Mariano Arista, the man who had executed Antonio Zapata and brought Antonio Canales back into the fold. And indeed, Antonio Canales was serving now under General Arista in the first two battles of the Mexican-American War on the north side of the Rio Grande. But Arista and Canales were outmatched by General Taylor at the later named battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. General Arista ended up having to retreat with his forces across the Rio Grande, and he didn't stop until he'd reached Monterrey, which meant that he had passed right over all of the Rio Grande Villas. Once again, it seemed that the government of Mexico was abandoning the Rio Grande Villas rather than fight for them. Canales and Carvajal were legitimately torn at this point. Should they continue to serve a nation that continuously abandoned them whenever their people were threatened? Or should they seek again to ally themselves with foreign elements in some desperate ploy to create a semi-autonomous or even vassal state of the United States? But they knew that the latter option wouldn't really work. General Taylor had already blown them off, and there was pretty widespread disillusionment amongst Tejanos in Texas by this point as to how independence had worked out for them, and now, even worse, Texas had agreed to annex itself to yet another distant foreign power that was probably even less concerned about Tejanos' needs than the governments in Mexico City or Austin had been. And so Canales and Carvajal decided to navigate a clever middle path. They offered their services to the Tamaulipas state militia, but not to the Mexican nation at large. Their loyalty was and remained to their region, to their pueblos. The central government could go to hell, which it did actually rather quickly over the course of the next 2 years as the United States Army rolled over the Mexican regular forces and by September of 1847 found itself master of Mexico City. Back in Tamaulipas, however, now Brigadier General Antonio Canales and Colonel José María Carvajal proved to be some of the most successful commanders of Mexican forces during the otherwise disastrous war. They were a constant thorn in the side of U.S. occupying forces in Tamaulipas, and one historian has described Canales as, quote, the U.S. Army's most resolute foe, end quote. Canales and Carvajal's vaqueros, which never numbered more than a few hundred men, ran circles around Taylor's patrols, and eventually forced Taylor to move his men only in highly armed convoys through the countryside. Even then, the road between the Rio Grande and Monterrey was, quote, dotted with the skeletons of men and animals. Roofless and ruined ranchos, and many a dark and smoldering heap of ashes told the disasters, end quote. The old Rio Grande Federalists' effectiveness was illustrated in a perverse way by the series of atrocities and counter-atrocities that their raiding provoked. Quote, entire towns were razed when suspected of guerrillista sympathy, end quote. As if his role in attacking Lipantitlan or in defeating the Mir expedition wasn't enough, Canales' effectiveness in opposing U.S. forces during the Mexican War secured for him the enduring hatred of Texan chroniclers. Yet it also cemented his reputation locally as the consummate defender of his people, of the pueblos, to return to that term. Once again, when the Mexican central government had abandoned the Rio Grandes, it was Canales who hung around to defend them. And he was rewarded for his service to his state in 1851 by his election as governor of Tamaulipas. Yet at precisely the same time, his compadre, José María Carvajal, went a different direction. Just as Antonio Canales was entering the warm embrace of the establishment, Carvajal resurrected the Republic of the Rio Grande once again. In a familiar echo of all of the previous revolutions in the region, Carvajal's two main justifications for revolt were the same. First, the central government's failure to protect the northeastern provinces from hostile Indians, who still, between 1847 and 57, were killing an average of 130 civilians per year on the Rio Grande frontier. And second, the need to lower tariff duties, which still jacked up prices artificially for the residents of the Rio Grandes. Carvajal published these justifications on September 3, 1851, in a document which he called the Plan de la Loba. But he didn't call this new nation the Republic of the Rio Grande. Reflecting his larger ambitions, he called it the Republic of the Sierra Madre. There's something, however, a little less genuine or maybe just a little more disturbing about Carvajal's Republic of the Sierra Madre. Whereas the Republic of the Rio Grande was truly homegrown and provisioned by the resourcefulness of the insurgents themselves, Carvajal's movement in 1851 was heavily financed by a cabal of Brownsville merchants, covetous of the profits that they would reap from a more open trade policy with northern Mexico. The second major source of funds for Carvajal's revolt was also unsettling. It came from the sale of disputed Mexican land titles lying between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, which helped contribute to several generations' worth of litigation and also accelerated Tejanos' loss of land to Anglo newcomers. And the third and final source of funding was even darker. Carvajal promised his supporters to enact a fugitive slave law in his new republic and to return the estimated 4,000 runaway slaves then living in northeastern Mexico. All of which is to say that the support for northeastern Mexican separatism by this point in time, at least amongst Anglo-Texans, was pretty mercenary. And yet some Texans did volunteer, most notably the famed Texas Ranger Rip Ford, and Carvajal's revolt did garner some local support, at least initially. Carvajal, with his left arm still in a colorful sling from his wound at the Battle of Alcantara in 1839, crossed the Rio Grande in September of 1851 and made sure that his first conquest was Guerrero, that old hotbed of federalism and revolt, hometown of Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, hometown of Antonio Zapata. Next, Carvajal marched on to Camargo, which he also captured, and then Reynosa, which fell just as quickly. Carvajal immediately followed through on his promise to the Brownsville merchants, reducing tariffs by 1/3 and collecting a windfall from the flurry of imports that followed. With these new revenues, Carvajal was able to recruit even more men, though again, principally mercenaries from Texas. By the time he marched on Matamoros, around October 8, 1851, more than half of his 700-man force were Anglo-Texans. And this, of course, created terrible optics for Carvajal. Because if the residents of the Rio Grande Villas had been skeptical of Anglo-Texans in 1840, before the Mexican-American War, they were outright hostile to them now. It didn't help Carvajal that he spoke English a little too well, and worst of all, was himself a Protestant. Even amongst Mexican Federalists, this was cause for suspicion. As such, Matamoros put up a stubborn resistance to Carvajal and his army, bogging them down in a multi-week siege. Not necessarily because they weren't sympathetic ideologically to Carvajal. Some leaders of the city actually offered to join his cause, but only on the condition that he run the Texan mercenaries out of his army. Carvajal refused, however, given that Texans were a pretty key component of his support. On October 30th, 1851, as he was still besieging Matamoros, Carvajal received some disturbing news. The Tamaulipecan state militia was marching on him, which wasn't surprising in and of itself, but what may have been surprising was who was in command of the state militia closing in on him now. It was his old compadre and current governor of Tamaulipas, Antonio Canales, who actually resigned the governorship precisely to lead troops in the field against his old ally. More than ally, as we've mentioned, they were compadres at this point. Carvajal's son was married to Canales' daughter, and actually 2 of Canales' sons were in Carvajal's army, which was all a little too suspiciously incestuous, even for commentators at the time. Was Canales really marching to confront Carvajal? Maybe Canales was legitimately appalled at the presence of so many Texans in Carvajal's army. Canales would later disparage the revolt as, quote, toda extranjera, end quote, totally foreign. But some wondered if Canales perhaps was marching to join up with Carvajal. Was some larger conspiracy at play here? If so, Carvajal didn't play the part very well. He didn't just hand over his army as soon as Canales arrived outside of Matamoros, as some suspected he would. But maybe Carvajal's ego had gotten the better of him. By this point, he had begun telling people of his desire to be the George Washington of northern Mexico. If the showdown was sincere, which it kind of seems like it was, it recalls in a really interesting way the similar scene that played out outside the town of Guerrero in 1839, when Antonio Zapata had squared off against his old mentor, Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara. Once again, 2 Federalist brothers-in-arms were ranged against each other, the elder in each instance having come to represent the establishment, the younger refusing to temper his revolutionary fervor. The elder counseling his protege not to ally himself with foreigners to advance a domestic cause, the younger refusing to distinguish between allies in whatever form they might come. There's a beautiful, if not tragic, parallel to it all. Once it was clear that Canales' intentions were hostile, Carvajal retreated. Canales followed him. Near Cerralvo, a town about halfway between the Rio Grande Villas and Monterrey, Canales caught up to Carvajal. Carvajal turned and gave battle, but his men didn't put up much of a fight. In the end, he and his men retreated back across the Rio Grande, where they spent the winter on the now indisputably Texas side of the river. But Carvajal tried again in February of 1852, crossing the Rio Grande, and this time focusing his energies on Camargo. Camargo, the town that Carvajal had relocated to after being run out of Texas following San Jacinto. The town where Zapata had come to Canales to engage his services as a surveyor. The town where Canales had come to make his name as a young man. the town where Canales and Carvajal had first met each other, the town where Canales and Carvajal had raised their Rio Grande revolt back in November of 1838 together. Whether he intended it or not, there was symbolism in Carvajal's choice of Camargo. But none of this seemed to matter to Canales. In the words of a Carvajal biographer, quote, Canales, not known for being an aggressive fighter, surprised all by ordering an immediate attack on Carvajal's advancing forces, end quote. Carvajal was defeated once again. And in fact, the battle threatened to dissolve into a massacre. At one point, Carvajal and his last 80 men were pinned down in a thicket and surrounded by hundreds of Canales' regulars. For 3 hours, Carvajal held off Canales and his men, but what ultimately saved them was the arrival of a contingent of Carrizo Indians from the Texas side of the river, who helped Carvajal and his men fight their way back. These old Indian brothers of Antonio Zapata once again came to the fighting rescue of their friend, in this case, Carvajal, whose bravery on the battlefield was unquestionable, and by this point, a bit of the stuff of legends as well. And yet others would say that it wasn't the Carrizo's bravery that saved Carvajal. It was Canales' mercy. Canales had Carvajal trapped, surrounded. He could have easily slaughtered the fiery little Federalist there in the monte with his artillery. But he chose not to. And in fact, not only did Canales not attack Carvajal, he actually ordered his forces to retreat at the end of the day. He later claimed he did this in an attempt to lure Carvajal out of his hole, but in retrospect, it sure looks like Canales let Carvajal go. This doesn't mean that the Canales-Carvajal telenovela is over, however. After the Battle of Cerralbo, Carvajal returned quietly to civilian life. Until the next foreign intervention in Mexico, this time in 1861 by the French-supported Emperor Maximilian. To oppose Maximilian, Carvajal raised his own force, the Fieles de Tamaulipas they called themselves, and they played hell on the imperialists up and down the Gulf Coast for 3 years. In much the same way that Canales had during the American intervention 15 years before, Carvajal sort of grew into the role of preeminent regional caudillo during this French intervention. And in 1864, after 3 years of guerrilla warfare, Carvajal was appointed governor in exile of Tamaulipas in his own right. Right after the U.S. Civil War ended, Carvajal was actually dispatched to the U.S. by none other than Benito Juárez to buy arms and to help secure U.S. support for the Mexican anti-imperialist cause, both of which Carvajal succeeded in. He then returned to the governorship of Tamaulipas after his mission, but his absence, it seemed, had weakened his political support locally. In 1866, just as the French and imperialist forces were collapsing, the Tamaulipas legislature removed Carvajal and appointed one of their own. They appointed a man named Servando Canales, the son of Antonio Canales, and son-in-law to José María Carvajal. It's as hard now to make complete sense of this as it was back then. An American observer at the time described it as, quote, the funniest affair I had ever witnessed, end quote. The old brush fox, Antonio Canales, died a few years later in 1869. The fiery José María Carvajal followed him in 1874. They could each make a case for having been heroes to their homelands, defenders of their patria. And yet, Mexican historiography mostly remembers men like Canales and Carvajal as caudillos who tragically destabilized the early Mexican Republic. Quoting scholar Timothy Enna, quote, it is the more or less unanimous opinion of Mexican society today that the lack of political cohesion in the 19th century is what laid Mexico open to the greatest disasters of its national history. The loss of Texas in 1836, the loss of the northern provinces of the Republic to the invading United States in 1847, waves of civil war, political chaos, and foreign intervention. The unspoken impression seems to be that the disunity that reigned in Mexico by the 1830s happened because of federalism, end quote. What we have to keep in mind, however, is that ultimately, centralism won the ideological war in Mexico. Particularly in the 20th century, when much of the project of Mexican historians became justifying the centralizing impulses of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, and linking them to the events of the past. In some ways, it's an understandable response to the trauma of the early years of Mexican independence and to the violence of the Mexican Revolution to look at regional expressions of autonomy as fundamentally destabilizing. But it probably doesn't accurately explain the people's, the pueblos, enduring attraction to a more devolved form of government. And in that context, we might observe, as historian Nettie Lee Benson did many years ago, that, quote, it's time to recognize that the effort of the Mexican center to rebuild its weakened hegemony over all aspects of government in the early republic, not the refusal of the states to obey the center, was the more profound source of Mexico's political turmoil, end quote. And to that end, it's worth pointing out that it was a federalist administration under Benito Juárez that ultimately defeated the last great foreign threat to Mexican independence, the French intervention of the 1860s. And if we're allowed to speak in generalities, the old centralists by and large aligned themselves with the French pretender, while it was the provinces that opposed and eventually defeated him. Yet even with this victory, elites in Mexico City continued to persist, quote, in their assumption that the nation was themselves, end quote. Even today, tell a Mexican that you were in Mexico last week, and they'll assume you mean Mexico City. By contrast, tell a resident of Mexico City that you were anywhere else in the country that week, and they'll nod and acknowledge the beauty of the provincia, which is their word for everywhere else that isn't the capital. And all of this was only reinforced later by the 4-decade-long centralizing rule of Porfirio Diaz, who ultimately was toppled, it should be noted, by a revolt of northeasterners from Coahuila, who in large part planned, staged, and launched their revolt from the northern shore of the Rio Grande. And yet, just as the trauma of the Federalist Wars of Mexico's 19th century seemed to require a centralizing Porfirio Diaz to come along and heal the wounds of the nation, the eventual triumph of the revolutionaries in the Mexican Revolution in the early years of the 20th century seemed to require the overwhelming centralizing impulses of the Institutional Revolutionary Party. All of this has left the voices of those from the border outside of the official narratives, both of Mexican history and American history, frankly. It means that we don't know the names of people like Antonio Zapata, Antonio Canales, or José María Carvajal. And I think that Texans ought to be uniquely well equipped to sympathize with the injustice of this, and maybe to do something about it, on the next and final episode of the Republic of the Rio Grande. Thank you for listening. In February of 2022, we'll be conducting almost a month's worth of fieldwork to uncover archaeological evidence for the location of the Battle of Medina, the largest battle in Texas history. If you want to learn more about the battle, go back and listen to Season 2 of this series. If you want to learn more about our search and our partnership with the 501c3 American Veterans Archaeological Recovery Project, go to www.brandonseale.com. Editing for this episode was provided by Susana Canseco. The portrait of Antonio Zapata that serves as the cover art for this season was created by artist Matt Tumlinson. Check him out at Matt_Tumlinson on Instagram. Sound engineering for this episode was performed by Stephen Bennett, who also arranged and performed the theme music. The theme music was actually written, however, by Mercurio Martinez, a Zapata County rancher, county treasurer, school principal, and descendant of one of Escandon's founding families. Martinez was the co-author of the first history of Zapata County, which he titled The Kingdom of Zapata, and in his spare time, he penned corridos. Well, I found one of his corridos in his collected papers at Texas A&M's Cushing Library, and in that corrido, Martinez had written a melody that he had intended for his Corrido de la Presa, the story of the construction of Lake Falcon and of his role in preserving what he could of the communities later lost to the lake. I love that we've been able to bring back to life this melody here, and I thank Stephen for it. You can check out Stephen's work at Noso Media, that's NOSO Media.com. I want to call out here for recognition the work of Juan José Gallegos. A retired NASA engineer, Gallegos went back to get a master's in history from the University of Houston and produced an incredible thesis dedicated to the life of Antonio Zapata, which in part inspired this season. Thanks as well to Professor Stan Green at Texas A&M University in Laredo. Professor Green actually has a book coming out soon about these events and others, currently titled Las Villas del Norte, A History from 1748 to 1821. Definitely don't miss the Museum of the Republic of the Rio Grande in downtown Laredo if you're ever there. They have brand new exhibits that they've just opened telling more of the story that we're recounting here. And if you're interested in the history or genealogy of the Villas del Norte, check out Moisés de la Garza's website, lasvillasdelnorte.com. Thanks additionally to Cesarino Hosa, my touring buddy for these old towns in Mexico, and descendant himself of some of the first founders of the Lower Rio Grande. And thank you to Javier Cervantes with the Tatpilan Coahuiltecan Nation, and Juan Mancias with the Carrizo Come Crudo Nation for their guidance too. For more information generally, check out our website at www.brandonseale.com.